During the autumn months of 1863, in a western district of Missouri, that old cartographers continued to label as Blackwater, 9 entire households disappeared within a single harvest season. Not 9 individuals, 9 complete families. Men, women, children, grandparents, farmhands. Even the dogs that had slept beneath the porches. By the time the first killing frost arrived in November, 9 separate farmsteads stood exposed to the wind with meals still half consumed on their tables, cradles continuing to rock in the drafts, and Bibles remaining open to whatever passages had been under read when the event, whatever it had been, occurred. The county clerk who originally assembled the list of the missing was himself, deceased before Christmas arrived. The ledger he maintained remained sealed within a locked cabinet at the Jefferson City State House for over 6 decades, until a historian finally forced it open during the 1920s. Inside, he discovered a single sheet of paper pinned to the interior cover, inscribed in a trembling hand. Upon that sheet were written 4 words that have never received adequate explanation. Before proceeding further with the forgotten story of Blackwater County, kindly subscribe to this channel and indicate in the comments which state or city you're listening from tonight. What you're about to hear represents the type of history deliberately buried. Those who interred it counted on universal forgetfulness. The 4 words on that pinned sheet read, "They took them willing." To comprehend why a county clerk in western Missouri would scrawl those 4 words in a quavering hand before consuming laudanum at a Sedalia boarding house and dying from what the coroner politely termed nervous exhaustion, you must first understand what Blackwater County represented in the summer of 1863 and what it had transformed into by the time the final family vanished. You must grasp a particular variety of American darkness that wears no uniform, rides beneath no flag, yet flourishes in the gaps between flags, when the ordinary conventions between neighbors have been suspended by the greater cruelty of the world. You must understand, in essence, what civil war does to the land and its inhabitants when the armies remain distant. The only soldiers you ever encounter are those who knock at your door after midnight. Blackwater County sat alongside the lower stretches of the Blackwater River, a slow, moving brown waterway that fed into the Lamine and eventually into the Missouri. The land was productive, not the Black River, bottom soil of the lower Mississippi, but rolling prairie intersected by timber, with limestone outcroppings, clear springs, and sufficient flat ground between the hills to cultivate respectable crops of hemp, tobacco, and winter wheat. Families had established themselves there since the 1830s, most arriving from Kentucky and Tennessee via flatboat and wagon, bringing with them the accents and stubborn Scotch, Irish pride of the Upper South. They brought their ballots and their feuds, their cornbread recipes and whiskey-making methods, their suspicion of strangers, and their fierce loyalty to kin. They brought a certain hardness forged by 3 generations of clearing timber and breaking sod, and they brought a softness residing just beneath that hardness, a maternal tenderness that emerged at barn raisings, weddings, and funerals. That softness would eventually be weaponized against them. By 1860, the census recorded slightly over 4,000 souls in the county, scattered across approximately 600 farms, with 2 small towns at the crossroads, and a 3rd settlement down by the river landing, where steamboats had called before the war. The landing settlement was named Marlowe's Ferry, after the man who had first operated a flatboat across the river in 1834. It featured grain warehouses, a blacksmith shop, a general store, and 3 saloons, conducting a brisk trade in pork, tobacco, hemp, and the rougher commerce that typically accumulates around river ports. Upstream, at the intersection of the old state road and the military road, stood the county seat, a town called New Salisbury with a red brick courthouse constructed in 1851, a jail of hewn stone, a bank, 2 churches, and a row of clapboard storefronts facing the square. Every county resident visited New Salisbury at least twice annually, once to pay taxes, and once to attend the Fall Circuit Court. Everyone knew everyone else by sight, if not by name. The families residing there were not wealthy. A handful owned enslaved individuals, typically 1 or 2 house servants and a field hand or 2. Most, however, were ordinary farmers who worked their own land with their own hands and their own sons. They attended church on Sundays at one of 4 small white frame meeting houses. They buried their dead in family plots on the back 40 acres. They trusted their neighbors because necessity demanded it. The nearest physician was 11 miles away in fair weather and 3 days distant, when the roads turned bad. If a child fell ill with fever at midnight, you didn't wait for the county doctor. You rode to the nearest farmhouse and knocked. The man who answered, regardless of his politics, his fatigue, or whatever grudge might have existed between your families, would take his coat from its peg and ride back through the darkness with you. That trust, that web of small loyalties between neighbors, was the first casualty of war. Missouri in 1863 was not a battlefield in the manner of Virginia. No great armies marched across it in blue and gray formations. No Gettysburgs, no Antietems, no long fields of corpses arranged in rows for photographers to document. Instead, what existed was something older, more intimate, and considerably more terrible. It was a war of neighbors against neighbors. The boy who had kissed your daughter the previous spring, now riding up your lane with a pistol and a grudge. The man who had helped raise your barn in '59, now informing on your husband to the Home Guard. The state had officially declared for the Union. But in the western counties, where the Missouri River bent southward, and the land reached toward Kansas, loyalties divided straight down the middle of every family and every congregation. Brothers rode for opposing sides. Fathers disowned sons. Wives denounced husbands from pulpits. Old men who had voted Whig Democrat, and nothing, throughout their long lives now voted with their rifles, and not always for the side their neighbors expected. Into that broken country came the bushwhackers. They called themselves partisan rangers, guerrillas, or simply boys. The Union called them murderers. They rode in small bands of 10 or 20, armed with revolvers and shotguns, moving through timber and river bottoms like phantoms. They burned out Union sympathizers, ambushed federal patrols, and lived off civilian farms, demanding meals, fodder, and horses, and woe to the family that refused. On the other side, the Home Guard and enrolled Missouri militia, often staffed by men with personal scores to settle, rode up the same lanes in blue coats and performed much the same work, only with state authority behind them. A farmer in Blackwater County during the summer of '63 might be robbed at breakfast by one armed band, and at supper by another. Neither band would feel obligated to leave him alive when finished, because in a war where everyone is guilty of something, killing a witness constitutes merely a small matter of housekeeping. The most famous bushwhacker, a lean-faced schoolteacher named William Clark Quantrill, had ridden into the Kansas town of Lawrence on the morning of August 21st, 1863, with 450 men at his back. By sunset that same day, 150 unarmed civilians lay dead in the streets, and the entire town center was burning. Every household in Blackwater County knew the Lawrence forgotten tale by the first week of September. Every household understood its implications. The rules, whatever rules had ever existed, were finished. If a man with 400 horsemen could ride into a town of 2,000 and kill men and boys in their nightshirts while their wives watched, then nothing was safe anywhere, no door was thick enough, and no neighbor could be relied upon. The federal response to Lawrence came 4 days later, on August 25th, in the form of a single document signed by Brigadier General Thomas Ewing, Jr., commanding the District of the Border. It was designated General Order No. 11. It instructed every person residing in the 4 western Missouri counties of Jackson, Cass, Bates, and the northern half of Vernon, with the exception of a narrow strip along the military roads, to abandon their homes within 15 days. They could take whatever they could carry. Everything else, the order stated, would be seized or burned. The purpose, Ewing wrote, was to deny the bushwhackers their civilian support base by emptying the country of civilians altogether. Families who had lived in those counties for 40 years were given 2 weeks to become refugees. 20,000 people were turned out onto the roads before the first frost, and the country they left behind was known for a generation afterward as the Burnt District. What Ewing didn't put in writing, but what every officer under his command understood, was that the 4 named counties were not the only counties where the order would be enforced in practice. Any county within a day's ride of the Kansas line, and any county where guerrilla activity was reported could be treated identically at local commanders' discretion. Blackwater County was not on the official list, but by mid-September 1863, Blackwater County had a small federal garrison stationed at the county seat, commanded by an Illinois captain named Josiah Pickering. Captain Pickering had been given considerable discretion indeed. This is the country, and this is the moment in which 9 families vanished. The first to go was the Hollister family. Ephraim Hollister was 51 years old, a widower with 4 grown children still at home and 2 grandchildren in a back bedroom. His wife Martha had died of milk sickness in 1858, and he had raised the youngest children alone with the help of his oldest daughter Rebecca, who had been 23 that summer and already had 2 little ones of her own after her husband was killed at Wilson's Creek in '61. Ephraim owned 160 acres on the eastern branch of the Blackwater River, a sound cabin with a stone chimney, a spring house, a smokehouse, a tobacco barn, and a team of Belgian draft horses purchased at a Boonville sale the previous spring. He was known county-wide as a quiet man, a fair dealer, a stricter Baptist who didn't drink spirits or tolerate cursing, and a reliable neighbor who had never in his life turned anyone away from his door. On the morning of September 14, 1863, a man named Asa Crenshaw rode over to the Hollister place to borrow a whetstone for his scythe. Crenshaw was 63, a Methodist lay preacher with a bad limp from a youthful horse accident, living about a mile and a quarter away across the timber. He had known Ephraim Hollister for 22 years. They had helped each other at every harvest since before the war. They had buried each other's wives. They had shared the last good jug of peach brandy in the county on the 4th of July in '62, sitting on Hollister's porch with their feet up and arguing about the war until the moon descended behind the trees. When Asa Crenshaw rode into the Hollister yard that morning, the dogs were gone. That was the first thing he noticed. The Hollisters kept 3 hounds and a yellow mongrel that slept on the porch, and none appeared. The second thing Crenshaw noticed was that the chickens remained in the yard scratching at the packed earth, and nobody had thrown them corn. Ephraim Hollister threw corn to the chickens every morning before breakfast, something you could set a watch by. The third thing Crenshaw noticed as he rode closer was that the cabin's front door stood half open, and a gingham apron caught on the latch flapped gently in the morning breeze. Crenshaw called out from the yard, and when nobody answered, he tied his mule to the hitching post and walked onto the porch. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the door frame, listening, because the silence emanating from the cabin was the wrong kind of silence. the kind that has a shape to it, the kind a man who has lived his whole life in the country recognizes the way. He recognizes the sound of an approaching storm. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The table was set for breakfast for 7 people. Cornbread sat in the skillet on the hearth, cold now, with a knife beside it. A pitcher of buttermilk stood on the table, curdled and separating in the warm morning air, a fly walking along its rim. 7 plates, 7 tin cups, 7 places laid with knives and spoons. Not one had been touched. A half-peeled apple lay on a cutting board at the table's end, the peel still attached in one long spiral, as though the hand holding the knife had simply set it down and walked away. The back bedroom where Ephraim's daughter Rebecca slept with her 2 children was empty. The bed unmade, the quilt pulled back as if she had risen to answer a call. A child's rag doll lay on the floor, with one button eye missing. The loft where the 3 sons slept was empty. A clean shirt lay folded on the bed, as though someone had been about to put it on. Out in the yard, the draft horses remained in the barn, and the wagon still stood under the lean-to. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been broken. No blood. No sign of struggle. No tracks of wagon wheels leading away beyond those that had been there for weeks. The only thing out of place, Crenshaw would remember afterward, was that the Hollister family Bible, always kept on a small shelf above the hearth, had been taken down and laid open on the table, face up next to the cornbread skillet. The page it was open to was the 37th Psalms. Fret not thyself because of evildoers, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb. Asa Crenshaw rode to the county seat that same afternoon and reported the Hollisters missing to the sheriff. The sheriff was a tired man named Reuben Vaughn, who had been trying to hold the county together with his bare hands since the war started. He rode out to the Hollister farm the next morning with 2 deputies and found exactly what Crenshaw had described. He wrote a brief report, filed it with the county clerk, looked at the open Bible for a long time, then closed it gently and returned it to its shelf. He walked out of the cabin and stood on the porch in the cool September air, feeling for the first time in his 11 years as sheriff a fear that had nothing to do with bullets or blades. It was a fear of the absence of sound, a fear of 7 untouched place settings. Then, because there was a war on, and because men and women disappeared in Missouri every week in 1863 for 100 different reasons, he did what any sheriff would have done. He put the Hollister case at the back of a drawer and waited to see if anyone returned. No one returned. 6 days later, on September 20th, the Tillman family was gone. 8 people that time, including a grandmother of 74, who had been bedridden for 3 years with crippling arthritis that made her cry out every time she was moved from one side of the mattress to the other. The Tillman cabin was found exactly as the Hollister cabin had been found out. A meal laid out, this time a supper of beans and ham and cornbread gone cold in the pot, beds unmade, clothes in the press, livestock in the yard, hungry but alive. No blood, no tracks, no sign. And the old grandmother Eliza Tillman, who had not walked under her own power since the winter of '60, was gone from her bed with the covers turned back, and her wooden cane still leaning against the wall. Whoever had taken her had carried her out, and had done so gently enough that her little glass of laudanum on the bedside table hadn't even been spilled. 4 days after that, on September 24th, the Latham family vanished. 9 people that time. The Latham girl, Sarah, had been engaged to marry a boy from the next county over, and her wedding dress was found laid out on her bed, finished, pinned, ready for the final fitting. A small bouquet of pressed flowers, gathered for the wedding and tied with a blue ribbon, sat on the pillow beside the dress. the boy she was to marry. A young farmer named Caleb Renfro from across the river rode over when he heard the news and sat on the edge of her bed for 2 hours without moving. When he rode home, he wouldn't speak for 3 days. When he finally spoke, he said that Sarah would not have left that dress behind. Not for the devil himself, not for anything on earth. She had been working on it for 7 months. If she had walked out of that cabin and left that dress folded on the bed, then she had not walked out. Somebody had walked her out. And that, Caleb Renfro said, was what he could not live with. 3 weeks later, Caleb Renfro was found hanged in his father's barn. The coroner ruled it suicide. His father, who had taken the body down at dawn, never entirely agreed. By October 1st, Sheriff Vaughn had 3 empty houses on his desk and a growing certainty that whatever was happening was not the work of ordinary bushwhackers. Bushwhackers took horses, food, and revenge. They did not take entire families and leave the horses behind. They did not take grandmothers who could not walk, and they certainly did not take people so quietly that nobody within 3 miles heard a single gunshot or scream. The Latham farm lay within 800 yards of the Crenshaw place, and Asa Crenshaw had been awake that entire night with a sick calf in the barn. He had heard nothing. No hoofbeats, no voices, no barking dogs. Nothing at all, except once around 200 in the morning, the faint squeak of a wagon axle passing along the river road, which he had thought at the time was only a neighbor driving home late from town. On October 3rd, Vaughn rode to the federal garrison at the county seat and requested assistance from Captain Josiah Pickering. Pickering was a thin man of 34, sharp-featured, with a close, cropped beard and an Illinois accent, and a habit of cleaning his fingernails with a penknife knife, while others spoke. He listened to Vaughn's account of the 3 missing families with professional concern, asked quiet questions about the farm's locations, and inquired whether any of the missing families had been known to harbor guerrilla sympathies. When Vaughn said that as far as he knew they had not, Pickering nodded thoughtfully and wrote something in a small leather notebook. Then he told the sheriff that the disappearances were almost certainly the work of guerrillas crossing down from the Lamine Bottoms, and that the federal garrison had neither the men nor the orders to investigate civilian disappearances in an active war zone. Vaughn should go home and tend to the living. Reuben Vaughn left Pickering's office that afternoon with a cold feeling he could not put into words. 20 years later, on his deathbed in a small house outside St. Louis, he would try to explain that feeling to his grandson and fail. The grandson would write it down as best he could remember. It was, the old man said, the feeling of speaking to a man who already knew the answer to every question you were asking him, and who was waiting politely for you to stop asking them. And that was the feeling of being measured like a pig at the market by eyes that had already decided what price you were worth. In the weeks that followed, as the Missouri sky shifted from hot September blue to the flat pewter of October, and the first hard frosts came down from the north, 6 more families vanished from Blackwater County. The Corbins, 5 people, on October 11th, taken from a cabin near the head of Sugar Creek. The Osgoods, 7 people, on October 17th, taken from a fine 2-story clapboard house that had been the pride of the family for 3 generations, with a library of 40 books in the front room and a rosewood piano Mrs. Osgood had played every evening. The McCaskills, a family of 11 counting 2 hired hands, on October 24th, all taken from a big working farm with a dairy herd still lowing in the barn the next morning when a neighbor rode by, heard them, and stopped to investigate. A family named Risley, 4 people, on November 1st. A family named Wagoner, 6 people, on November 8th. And finally, On the night of November 15, 1863, a family named Beaumont, 10 people, the largest household in the county, vanished from a cabin that stood less than 2 miles from the federal garrison itself. 9 households, 67 people, not one body, not one witness, not one shot fired. The community's response to this progression was not what later historians might expect. It was not outrage, and it was not panic. It was something colder and more recognizable to anyone who has lived through a long and relentless war. The slow shrinkage of the human animal into itself. The pulling back of curtains, the locking of shutters, the quiet agreement among neighbors not to ride out after dark and not to ask too many questions of each other in daylight. By the first week of November, people in Blackwater County had stopped visiting each other for supper. By the second week, they had stopped waving from their wagons when they passed on the road. The churches emptied out. The general store in New Salisbury reported that women were sending their husbands to buy the weekly flour. Because the women no longer wanted to leave the farms, even for an hour, even on a Saturday morning. On the farms themselves, families slept in shifts, one man or boy awake at all times with a loaded shotgun across his knees, watching the road and the tree line by the light of a single candle that burned low and slow through the long October nights. But the thing the families could not protect themselves against, it would turn out, was not the thing they were watching for. They were watching for bushwhackers. They were watching for strangers. They were watching in their secret hearts for the galloping hoofbeats of Quantrill's men. Because every Missouri farmer that autumn had seen Quantrill in his dreams at least once. What they were not watching for was a polite knock at the door around 10:00 at night, a familiar face on the porch holding a lantern, and a quiet voice speaking words that could almost be mistaken for kindness. Decades later, long after the war had ended and the country had moved on to other nightmares, the empty farms of Blackwater County passed into regional folklore. Travelers passing through the area in the 1870s and 80s reported seeing lamps lit in windows of houses that had been abandoned for 20 years. A journalist from the Kansas City Star riding through on horseback in 1891 wrote a short piece about the phenomenon for the Sunday edition and called the region the County of Empty Tables. Because that, he said, was what every old homestead contained, an empty table set for a meal that nobody had lived to eat. School children growing up in New Salisbury in the early 20th century told each other forgotten tales about the Hollister cabin, still standing then in a corner of a cornfield, about the ghost of the little girl who had left her rag doll on the floor, and about the sound of a spiral of apple peel unrolling in an empty room. But the folklore was wrong in one important respect. The tables had not been empty when the families left. The tables had been full, and whoever or whatever had taken those families had not done so in haste or fear. They had done so with a patience and completeness suggesting something far worse than a bushwhacker raid. Somebody had come to those cabins, and somebody had led those families out into the night, one by one, over the course of 2 months, and somebody had made sure that no trace of their going was left behind. If you are finding this forgotten history as unsettling as I am, take a moment right now to hit the like button and leave a comment with your theory about what happened in Blackwater County. I read every comment, and your ideas shape the forgotten tales I tell next. Now, let us go back to the beginning, and let us look at what Sheriff Reuben Vaughn began to find when he finally stopped trusting the federal garrison and started investigating on his own. The first thing Vaughn noticed, once he laid the deeds of the 9 missing families out on the table in his small office at the county courthouse, was that the farms were not random. He had assumed at first that the bushwhackers, or whoever was responsible, had simply taken whichever families were easiest to reach. But when he plotted the 9 farms on a county map using little black pins, borrowed from the tailor shop next door, the pattern that emerged was not random at all. The 9 farms formed a rough arc along the eastern bank of the Blackwater River, stretching some 11 miles from the northern county line down to the river landing in the south. They were among the best watered, best timbered, most productive parcels in the entire county. They sat, taken together, astride the only natural corridor for any future railroad line that might be built from Boonville south toward the Ozarks. A corridor surveyed in 1850 by Midwestern Railroad and discussed in the newspapers of the time as a matter of near certainty. Once the war ended, the national economy recovered, and they were all, without exception, adjacent to land that had been acquired within the last 18 months by a single purchaser's estate, Lewis Land Company called Pickering and Latham Associates. Vaughn stared at that name for a long time. Pickering, the same surname as the federal captain at the garrison, and Latham, the same surname as the second missing family, whose patriarch, old Calvin Latham, had been one of the most vocal opponents of wartime land speculation in the county, and who had gone to his neighbors in the summer of 1863, warning them not to sell their deeds to any agent of any state, Lewis Company under any circumstances whatsoever. Old Calvin had been a fierce man, a veteran of the Black Hawk War, a man who carried his grievances written in a small notebook kept in the breast pocket of his coat. He had given speeches on the courthouse steps in June and July about the way the war was being used by men in St. Louis, Chicago, and Philadelphia to strip Western farmers of everything they had built. He had named names. He had pounded his fist on the courthouse porch rail until it shook. Calvin Latham had disappeared with his entire family on September 24th. Vaughn rode to the county recorder's office the next morning and spent 6 hours working through the deed books. What he found was this: Pickering and Latham Associates had between the spring of 1862 and the autumn of 1863 purchased 41 parcels of land in Blackwater County, all of them along the eastern bank of the Blackwater River, all within a mile of the 9 farms that had recently gone empty. The purchases had been made at remarkably low prices. In several cases, deeds had been signed over by widows whose husbands had been killed by guerrillas earlier that same year and who needed cash quickly to feed their children through the coming winter. In other cases, the sellers were listed as having relocated to Illinois or Iowa, though no forwarding addresses were recorded, and no one in the county seemed to know where exactly they had gone. And in a few cases, most troublingly, the signatures on the deeds looked, to Vaughn's careful eye, to have been written in a hand very different from the hand on other documents bearing the same name in the county records. Vaughn began, very cautiously, to ask questions. He rode out to the Wagoner place, one of the missing farms, and searched the abandoned cabin with a care he had not used on his first visit. He looked behind cupboards, lifted trunk lids, went up into the loft, and pulled back the mattress ticking on each bed. In a hollow beneath a loose floorboard under the bed in the main room, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and tied with a strip of cotton, he found a small packet of letters. The letters were addressed to Samuel Wagoner, the head of the missing family. They had been written over a period of 4 months between June and October of 1863, and they were signed by an agent of Pickering and Latham Associates named Horace Osgood. Horace Osgood, the same surname as another missing family. Vaughn sat down on the edge of the Wagoner's bed and read the letters in order from first to last, by the slanted afternoon light, coming through the cabin's single window. The letters were, on their surface, polite business correspondence. The first one, dated June 8th, introduced Mr. Osgood as a representative of a St. Louis firm interested in acquiring agricultural land in Blackwater County for post-war development and offered Samuel Wagoner a fair market price for his 120 acres. The second letter, dated July 3rd, expressed polite disappointment at Mr. Wagoner's refusal and raised the offer by 15%. The third letter, dated July 29th, raised the offer again and mentioned, in a casual aside, that several of Mr. Wagoner's neighbors had recently accepted similar offers and had relocated with their families to new lands in central Iowa that the company had arranged to purchase on their behalf. The fourth letter, dated August 20th, was different in tone. It mentioned by name the wife and children of Samuel Wagoner. It asked, with apparent sympathy, about the health of young Elias Wagoner, who Mr. Osgood had heard was just beginning his first year at the county school. It observed in closing that the countryside had become a very dangerous place for young families in these troubled times, and that a man with children bore responsibilities that a childless man could not fully understand. The fifth letter, dated September 10th, 6 days before the Hollister family vanished, spoke at length about the difficulty of protecting a rural family from the depredations of bushwhackers and home guard alike in such a dangerous time, and expressed the writer's genuine hope that Mr. Wagoner would reconsider his position before events overtook the matter. The sixth letter, dated October 4th, contained a single sentence that made Reuben Vaughn sit down on the Wagoner's dusty floor and put his face in his hands. The sentence read, "We have arrangements, Mr. Wagoner, that can provide for the safety of your family in exchange for your cooperation, and we would be grieved to see you refuse a kindness that others in your position have been grateful to accept." Others in your position. Vaughn rode back to town with the letters in his saddlebag. That night, in the small room he rented above the dry goods store, he began to understand what had happened. Or he began to understand a version of what had happened, which turned out not to be the whole of it, though it was enough to get him killed. Some of the missing families, he reasoned, had been coerced. They had been told that bushwhackers or federal troops were coming for them, and offered safe passage out of the county, probably in exchange for signing their deeds over to Pickering and Latham Associates. They had left in the night, walking or riding with an escort, promised new land in Illinois or Iowa. Whether any of them had actually made it to Illinois or Iowa was another question entirely. But at least some of them, he believed, had walked out of their cabins willingly, believing they were being saved. Perhaps, he thought in the dim hours before morning, perhaps some of them had indeed been sent on. Perhaps the first 2 or 3 families had actually boarded a wagon, ridden to a distant depot, reached Iowa, and received new land. Because that was how a scheme of this kind would have to begin. You would have to send the first few families through the machine honestly, so that their letters back to the county would confirm the story, so that the next families would trust the offer. But somewhere along the way the scheme had changed. Somewhere along the way the men running it had realized that they did not need to pay for new land in Iowa if they could simply make the families disappear and forge the deeds. Somewhere along the way the cost of moving 67 people to another state had exceeded the profit the land company was willing to accept, and the mathematics of the enterprise had been adjusted. That was the meaning of the 4 words Vaughn would pin a month later to the inside cover of his ledger. They took them willing. The families had gone willingly, led out by people they trusted or people they had reason to fear, believing at least in that first hour that they were being rescued from something worse. The worst part was that the people who led them out had known from the beginning where the road actually ended. But Vaughn did not know yet what had happened to them after they left their cabins. He did not know whether they had been put on a train at some distant depot and sent to Iowa as promised, or whether they had been led to a quieter fate in the timber somewhere south of the river. He did not know which of his neighbors were part of the scheme and which were merely its victims. He did not know who in the Pickering family was the mastermind and who was the errand boy. He did not know any of these things yet, and he was about to make the mistake of trying to find out. On the morning of November 22nd, 1863, 1 week after the disappearance of the Beaumont family, Sheriff Reuben Vaughn rode to the federal garrison and requested a formal meeting with Captain Josiah Pickering. He brought with him a canvas satchel containing the Wagoner letters, a copy of the deed records from the county recorder, and a list of 41 parcels of land he believed had been acquired by fraud, coercion, or worse. He intended to confront Pickering directly with the evidence and give him one chance, as a Union officer, to explain himself before Vaughn sent a copy of the evidence to the provost marshal in Jefferson City. Pickering received him cordially, offered coffee, and listened without interrupting for 45 minutes while Vaughn laid out the evidence on the captain's desk. Speaking with the steady, methodical voice a lawman uses when building his case in public, he examined the deed records. He read the Wagoner letters slowly, one by one, in the order they had been written. When he finished, he set the last letter down on the desk and looked up at Vaughn with a small, thoughtful expression on his thin face. He said, "Sheriff, I believe you have done a remarkable piece of work here, and I'm going to ask you to do one more thing before we proceed. I'm going to ask you to wait here in this office for 1 hour while I send for a colleague of mine from the provost's office in Sedalia. He needs to hear this from you directly. Will you wait?" Reuben Vaughn, who had been a sheriff in Missouri for 11 years and had seen men lie to him in 100 different ways, looked at Captain Josiah Pickering across the desk and did not see a single sign of deceit. He did not see a single sign of anything at all. Pickering's face was as smooth and empty as a plate. Vaughn said he would wait. Pickering rose, put on his coat, and walked out of the office. What happened in the next 40 minutes is known only from a letter Vaughn wrote that same afternoon to his sister in St. Louis, mailed from a farmhouse 5 miles west of town, after riding out of the garrison through a side gate at a flat gallop with a federal bullet through the crown of his hat. In the letter, Vaughn described hearing, through the closed door of Pickering's office, the captain's voice speaking quietly to a sergeant in the outer room, giving instructions that included the words, "No trial," and "Rever," and "Tonight." He described understanding, in a single cold moment, what those 3 words meant when put together, and what they had meant on 9 previous occasions over the preceding 2 months. He described climbing out the office window, dropping into a narrow alley between garrison buildings, working his way through the stable yard crouched behind a water trough, while a stable hand whistled a tune 2 feet away, and did not see him, stealing a cavalry horse whose reins he cut with his pocket knife, because he did not have time to untee them, riding south through the timber with 2 troopers in pursuit, firing revolvers at his back. He described, at the letter's end, his conviction that he was not going to live very long. He asked his sister to keep the letter, and if anything happened to him, to take it to a particular lawyer in St. Louis, whose name he wrote in the margin. He closed the letter with a single sentence she would repeat in later years to anyone who asked about her brother's death. "I have seen," he wrote, "a face that belongs to the worst man I have ever met. And the worst thing about it is that it is the face of a man who believes himself to be an officer and a gentleman, and who has never for one moment doubted that he is." Just when you think the forgotten tale could not possibly get darker, the horror in Blackwater County intensifies. If this forgotten history is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark American mysteries. Or hit the like button to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss another one of these forgotten histories. Now let us find out what Sheriff Reuben Vaughn discovered in the last month of his life, and what he hid and where he hid it, so that somebody eventually might find it. Vaughn did not ride to Jefferson City. He understood, by the time he crossed the Lamine River the next morning, that if the conspiracy reached as high as a federal captain, it probably reached a good deal higher than that, and that the provost marshal's office was as likely to hang him as to hear him. Instead, he rode north into the timber country along the Missouri River and disappeared into a network of old friends, fellow Masons, and distant cousins stretching from Boonville to Glasgow. He spent the next 3 weeks living in barns and root cellars, moving every second night, never sleeping in the same place twice. He wrote in a small leather-bound notebook kept inside his shirt. Every scrap of information he could remember, and every piece of evidence he had gathered. He wrote down the names of the 41 parcels and the dates of each transaction. He wrote down the text of the Wagoner letters reconstructed from memory. He wrote down the words he had heard through Pickering's door. Then, in the first week of December, he did something nobody has ever fully understood. He rode back to Blackwater County. He did not go to the county seat. He did not go home. He did not stop at his own house, where his wife was still waiting, not knowing whether he was alive or dead, not knowing whether to wear mourning or keep his supper warm. He rode instead, in the middle of the night, to the farm of Asa Crenshaw, the old Methodist lay preacher who had been the first to discover the empty Hollister cabin back in September. Crenshaw took him in, fed him, and listened to his forgotten tale for 4 hours by the light of a single tallow candle. When Vaughn had finished, Crenshaw sat in silence for a long time with his hands folded on the table and his eyes fixed on the candle flame. Then he said something Vaughn wrote down in his notebook that same night. What Crenshaw said was this: "I think I know where they are, Sheriff. I think I have known for some time. And I think that when I show you, you will understand why I have not spoken of it sooner. And you will not, I think, find it in yourself to judge me too harshly. Because I'm an old man with a wife who cannot feed herself and 2 grandchildren in the back room. And the knowledge of what I am about to show you is the kind of knowledge that a man in this country, in this year of our Lord, cannot carry alone and live." The next morning, before dawn, the 2 men rode south along the Blackwater River to a place the old French voyagers had called the Bend, where the river made a sharp hook around a high limestone bluff, and the current cut a deep pool beneath the rock face. The pool was some 40 feet across and of uncertain depth. Local children had been warned away from it for as long as anyone could remember, because the current at the base of the bluff was treacherous, and because the limestone above had a way of shedding slabs without warning. And because, the older people said, the pool did not give back what it took. 2 boys had drowned there in the 1840s and 1 in the 1850s, and none of their bodies had ever been recovered. The river carries what it takes. The saying went, all the way down to the Gulf. Crenshaw dismounted at the edge of the bluff and led Vaughn to a narrow game trail that descended to the water. The trail was barely wide enough for a single horse, winding down through scrub cedar and limestone, emerging after perhaps 4 minutes of careful walking on a broad natural platform of pale rock some 12 feet above the pool. Halfway down, the trail passed a shelf of rock where the limestone had been recently disturbed. Fresh scratches showed where heavy stones had been rolled. The earth beneath the scratches was softer than the surrounding ground, as though it had been dug and refilled many times. Along the edge of the platform, where a person standing at the water's edge might pause before whatever came next, the rock face had been scored in a dozen places by what looked like boot nails and the drag of heavy heels. Crenshaw pointed to the shelf and said, "See it there? I came down here in late September, Sheriff, because I was looking for a lost calf somewhere. And I saw 2 men standing where we are standing now. And they were rolling a stone into the pool. I hid in the brush up above, where that cedar leans over the trail, and I watched them. They were strong men, Sheriff, working in their shirt sleeves. And the stone they rolled was the size of a whiskey barrel. By rights, it went into the water with a sound that I have not been able to get out of my dreams since. And when they were finished, and they had gone, I came down and I looked at what was left on the ground. And what was left on the ground was a child's shoe. Godfrey, a girl's shoe, Sheriff. Brown leather with a small brass buckle. It was the shoe of Ephraim Hollister's granddaughter. I had seen her wear it at the camp meeting in August. I picked it up. I took it home. I have it still hidden behind the loose board in my own spring house where my wife will not find it. And I have not spoken of it in 3 months because I have a wife and 2 grandchildren of my own, and I have a good Methodist knowledge of what this country has become. And I was afraid. God forgive me, Sheriff. I was afraid. Vaughn stood on the shelf and looked down at the dark water. He did not speak for a long time. The morning mist lay on the surface of the pool in thin gray ribbons, and a single crow called from the bluff above them. The water was so still that Vaughn could see his own face in it, looking back up at him from a great depth. Then he asked Crenshaw how many times the old man thought the stones had been rolled. Crenshaw said he could not be sure, but the disturbance of the earth suggested many separate occasions spread over the weeks when the families had been disappearing. Perhaps 1 visit for each family, perhaps 2 for the larger ones. Vaughn asked whether Crenshaw had recognized the 2 men he had seen. Crenshaw said that he had, and that this was the hardest part of what he had to tell. One of them, he said, was Horace Osgood, the land agent who had written the letters to Samuel Wagoner. The other, he said, was a sergeant from the federal garrison at the county seat, a man named Luther Pickering, the captain's cousin. Vaughn took out his notebook and wrote the 2 names down. Then he and Crenshaw rode back to Crenshaw's farm in silence. That night, in the preacher's barn, Vaughn copied every page of his notebook into a second ledger. A larger one Crenshaw had kept for his farm accounts and had never filled more than halfway. He worked by the light of a single lantern hung from a nail in a beam, writing for 6 hours. When he finished, he pinned to the inside cover a single sheet of paper on which he wrote, in a hand already beginning to shake from what he knew, 4 words. They took them willing. He did not mean by those words that the families had gone willing to their deaths. He meant that the families had gone willing out of their cabins, believing they were being saved, and that this was the worst part of the whole matter, because it meant they had trusted the men who killed them, and the men who killed them had used that trust as the instrument of the killing. He meant that a betrayal of that depth was something for which American law, as he had practiced it for 11 years, had no adequate name. He gave the ledger to Asa Crenshaw and asked him to hide it somewhere. No one would find it until the war was over, and the country had come to its senses. Crenshaw wrapped the ledger in double oilcloth, tied it with hemp cord, and buried it beneath the packed earth floor of his root cellar in a corner, behind the barrels of smoked pork. Under a stone he had marked on its underside with a small cross in candle suit. In the morning, Reuben Vaughn rode east toward Jefferson City for the second time, intending now to reach the State House in person and place the original notebook and his own sworn testimony into the governor's hands. He never arrived. On December 19, 1863, his body was found in a creek bed some 40 miles east of Blackwater County with 2 pistol balls in the back of his head. The official report listed the cause of death as murder by persons unknown, probably bushwhackers. His horse was never recovered. His saddlebags were empty. The notebook he had been carrying was gone. His widow received a brief letter of condolence from the office of the provost marshal, along with his watch, found in his vest pocket, and his wedding ring, which had been cut from his finger and was returned to her in a paper envelope, without explanation. The county clerk, a man named Elijah Redfern, who had helped Vaughn compile the original ledger of missing families in October, heard of the sheriff's death on the morning of December 22nd. He spent that afternoon in his office at the courthouse going through the papers Vaughn had left in his desk drawer and found enough there to understand, in outline, what his friend the sheriff had uncovered and what it had cost him. 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, Elijah Redfern took the coach to Sedalia. He rented a room at a boarding house on Ohio Avenue and wrote a summary of everything he knew in the margins of his personal copy of the county's missing persons register. He pinned a single sheet of paper to the inside cover on which he copied, in the same 4 words, the phrase Vaughn had given him. They took them willing. Then he walked to the apothecary on Main Street, purchased a bottle of laudanum, returned to his room, and drank the entire bottle before lying down on the bed with his hands folded over his chest. He was found by the boarding housekeeper the next morning, Christmas Day, 1863. The coroner ruled the death a case of accidental overdose from a medicine taken for nervous complaints. The ledger in his valise was returned unexamined to the clerk's office in New Salisbury, where it was placed in a locked cabinet by the acting clerk and forgotten. The ledger, buried beneath the floor of Asa Crenshaw's root cellar, remained where Crenshaw had put it. Crenshaw himself died of pneumonia in the winter of 1867, without telling anyone in his family what was buried beneath the cellar floor. He had intended several times to tell his son, had tried once on a Sunday afternoon in the spring of '66, and had lost his nerve halfway through a sentence, and turned the conversation to planting corn. The farm was sold out of the family in 1872 after his son moved west to Kansas in search of cheaper land. The new owners tore down the old cabin and built a new one on a different part of the property, and the root cellar, now abandoned, slowly filled with dirt and rubble and was forgotten. In the spring of 1923, a young historian from the University of Missouri named Ellsworth Hadley, working on a doctoral dissertation about the civilian cost of the Missouri guerrilla war, came to Blackwater County looking for primary sources. He spent 3 weeks interviewing elderly residents in their parlors and on their porches, patiently drawing out the forgotten tales their parents and grandparents had told them, and that they had never thought to write down. In the course of those interviews, he heard from the granddaughter of Asa Crenshaw a forgotten tale her grandmother had whispered on her deathbed about a sheriff who had come to the farm one night in the winter of '63 and left something important buried in the old root cellar before he rode east to die. The granddaughter had not known whether to believe the forgotten tale. Her grandmother had been 91 and had been in and out of her senses in her final week. But repeatedly interested, and because you seemed genuinely intrigued. Because was a polite man with a notebook and good manners, and she had nobody else to tell. Hadley got permission from the current owner to dig. On the afternoon of April 11, 1923, in a drizzling spring rain that turned the earth to cold clay under his hands, he unearthed a rotted oilcloth packet. Inside the packet, remarkably preserved, was Reuben Vaughn's second ledger. Hadley spent 6 months transcribing and verifying its contents. He rowed out to the bend, where the river still made its hook around the limestone bluff, and stood on the platform above the pool and looked down into the dark water. He cross-referenced the deed records. He tracked down what had become of Pickering and Latham Associates. He found, in the archives of the St. Louis Probate Court, the will of Horace Osgood, who had died a wealthy man in 1891, and whose estate at the time of his death included controlling interests in 4 Missouri banks, a St. Louis hotel, and some 13,000 acres of land along the Blackwater and Lamine rivers, including every one of the 41 parcels acquired by the Old Land Company during the war. He found that Captain Josiah Pickering, far from facing punishment, had been promoted to major, resigned his commission honorably in 1866, returned to Illinois, become a state senator, and died in his bed in 1904, widely mourned by his constituents. He found that Luther Pickering, the sergeant, had been killed in a saloon brawl in Kansas City in 1871, and that, at the time of his death, he had been carrying a silver pocket watch engraved with the initials E.H., which Hadley believed, though he could not prove, had belonged to Ephraim Hollister. And he found, most painfully, that the railroad line surveyed in 1859 had in fact been built in the 1880s, running directly along the corridor defined by the 41 parcels of Blackwater County land, and that the sale of those parcels to the railroad company in 1883 had made the heirs of Horace Osgood and Josiah Pickering richer in a single transaction than any of the 9 families killed for them could have imagined becoming in 20 lifetimes of honest work. Hadley submitted his findings, along with the ledger itself, to the Missouri Historical Society in the autumn of 1923. The Society's board of directors reviewed the material and, on a vote of 5-2, declined to publish. The minutes of that meeting, eventually declassified in the 1960s, indicate that the majority of the board believed the evidence was strong, but that the descendants of several of the families named in the ledger were prominent citizens of St. Louis and Chicago, and that publication would cause, in the words of the board chairman, a degree of distress disproportionate to the public interest at this remove of time. The ledger was placed in the Society's closed archives. Hadley's dissertation, under pressure from his department chair, was rewritten to focus on other, less controversial aspects of the Missouri War. Hadley himself, a deeply disappointed man who had spent his own money pursuing the investigation, took a teaching position at a small college in Indiana and did not publish on the subject again. He died in 1941, leaving behind a box of private papers that his wife donated to his alma mater, where they sat unread in a basement storage room for another 40 years. The ledger was finally read by outside researchers in 1967, when the Missouri Historical Society opened its closed archives for the state's centennial of the Civil War. 2 articles were written. One appeared in a regional historical journal, with a readership of perhaps 400 specialists. The other appeared in the Sunday supplement of a Kansas City newspaper, and was read by a few thousand people for a few days, and then forgotten. The descendants of the Pickering and Osgood families, by then scattered across 4 states and several generations, were never publicly named. No criminal investigation was ever opened because the statute of limitations on murder in the state of Missouri, though technically unlimited, is functionally meaningless when every person involved has been dead for half a century and every piece of physical evidence lies under 40 feet of river water. This forgotten history shows us something American history has always been uncomfortable saying out loud, that in the chaos of a great war, some people do not become heroes and some people do not become villains, but some people, quietly, in the shadow of real violence, use the cover of that violence to do small and terrible things for money. Those small and terrible things can remain hidden for 100 years because everyone involved has a reason to look the other way. The families of Blackwater County did not vanish. They were taken one by men they knew, who told them lies they wanted to believe, and they were walked down a narrow trail to a pool beneath a limestone bluff, and the river carried the evidence away. Their land was bought for pennies on the dollar. Their descendants, the ones sent away as small children in the first months of the scheme before the killings began, grew up elsewhere under new names and never knew. Their houses stood empty until the plows finally broke them down and the fields grew over. The railroad came, the stations were built, the towns along the line prospered. The children of the men who had done the killing went to good schools, served in legislatures, and were buried under marble monuments in cemeteries, far from the pool beneath the bluff. And the 4 words Sheriff Reuben Vaughn, pinned to the inside cover of his ledger in the last week of his life remain, perhaps, the truest 4 words anyone has ever written about that season in that county. They took them willing, because the deepest horror of Blackwater County was not the killing. The deepest horror was the trust that made the killing possible. It was the polite knock at the door after dark. It was the familiar face on the porch holding a lantern. It was the quiet voice saying, "Get the children dressed. It is not safe here anymore. Come with me and I will take you somewhere. You will be safe." It was the willingness of the human heart to believe that the worst thing cannot happen to it, because the person telling the lie is somebody it has known all its life. And it is the knowledge carried home by every one of those 67 people in the last 10 minutes of their lives, as the trail narrowed and the limestone platform came into view, and the men in the shadows stepped forward with the stones already prepared, that they had been wrong. What do you think of this forgotten history? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or do you think there are still families out there, descended from the survivors, who carry fragments of the truth without knowing what they mean? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this forgotten tale and want more forgotten histories like this one, subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who believes, as I do, that the past is never really past, and that the things we bury always eventually come back up. I will see you in the next video.